All right, so the Peloponnesian War, right? What you got to know about that was it was Greeks fighting someone.
The professor's back. You don't have to do it, Peyton.
Oh, thank God.
Professor, you're muted.
Yes, it was the Trojans and the okay.
Are you receiving me? You should be. Can
Yep.
you hear me?
Yep.
Yep, we're good now.
Oh, Professor, you got muted.
Yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can now.
You can hear me. Okay, at the end of the Persian War, slowly the feeling got about that the Athenians were really trying to create an empire. The Spartans had gone home, but they were, the Athenians were encroaching on Corinth, and moreover, they maintained this big fleet, but they asked the other Greek city-states, 150 of them, to basically pay a tribute to Athens in order to maintain this fleet. And over time, the other many of the other Greek city-states said, well, hey, we don't want to do this. We don't want to be part of this NATO alliance. You'll forgive the aside that I'm making at this point. We don't want to be part of this NATO alliance. But the Athenians said, well, we're going to send troops and ships to make sure that you continue to pay your tribute. So what I'm basically saying is that the Athenians became more and more arrogant, and they were, of course, the city of Athens was prospering, and they were militarily, it seemed, top dog, muscling aside commercial rivals and so on, and now demanding tribute from the other Greek city-states. As a result of that, after years of buildup of tension and even minor conflicts, all-out war breaks out. It starts in 431, and it continues for no less than 27 years. There are truces during that period, periods where there's a limited peace, but essentially the whole of Greece is ravaged by continuous war between 427 and 404 BC. The reason that the war lasted so long was that Athens was a sea power. It even got its food by sea. Most of its food came in by sea, and they controlled the sea lanes. The Spartans and their allies were essentially land force. So neither side could dominate neither side could dominate the other. And so the war just dragged on, and it was very destructive. It was very destructive economically and in terms of people. It finally ended, the decisive battle occurred not in the Greek mainland, but in Sicily. Today, the island of Sicily is part of Italy, of course. But back then, it was part of Greater Greece. And it was Corinth, which the the main city was Syracuse, which was a colony of Corinth. And the Corinthians had very close ties to Syracuse, the capital of Sicily. And the Corinthians, of course, were allied with the Spartans. Well, the Athenians, they were as frustrated as everybody else by virtue of this ongoing and unending conflict. So one of their generals, his name was Alcibiades, the Athenian general, got the idea, let's seize Syracuse and the island of Sicily, and we will ruin Corinth, and we will take over their food supply, and we will thereby become incontestably powerful, and we will win the war. So the Athenians in 215 dispatched their whole navy and something like 30 or 40,000 men are sent to conquer Syracuse and Sicily in 215 BC. Well, the Corinthians and the Spartans, seeing this, decide, well, if this is what the Athenians are up to, we're going to form an alliance with the Persians. And the Persians, who are our enemy, nevertheless, we're going to ally with them in order to block the ambitions of the Athenians. And as a result of this, the Athenians suffer a stunning defeat from which they never recover. Their fleet is destroyed, half their army is lost, and the Athenians, although the war continues for some years, they have to sue for peace in 404 BC. The Athenians suffer, they had this overweening pride, and now they are brought low. They are defeated. But of course, it's not merely the defeat of Athens. Really, the whole of Greece has been ruined by this war, which was a war of course, people who were of the same ethnic group, but because of the city-state structure, war was part of their way of life, and ultimately these wars between brothers, we can say, destroyed classical Greece. But what is notable is that, in fact, while all of this is happening, the 5th century is the culmination of Greek classical civilization, which is now, I'm turning my attention to this, what the achievements of the Greeks. Now, I have to obviously compress all this and so on, but I'm now discussing the 5th and continuing into the 4th century BC, the culture, because these cultural achievements of the Greeks during the 5th and beginning of the 4th century were the high point in terms of classical ancient civilization. It became the model. What was achieved in Greece during the 5th and early 4th century was the model for all education throughout the rest of antiquity. And as a matter of fact, the level that the Greeks reached from a cultural point of view, I don't say economic or technical, but from a cultural point of view, were not surpassed in the West until the 17th century. The West lived off the achievements of the Greeks for centuries. So this is quite important. Well, in the first place, let me mention the fact that somebody wrote the history of the Peloponnesian Wars. There was a historian by the name of Thucydides. Let me spell his name. who was, as a matter of fact, an Athenian general, who wrote the first sort of rational history of a particular period. He wrote about the Peloponnesian War. He knew that it was a great event, and he was obviously quite well educated, and he wrote a history which it doesn't really engage with the economic forces, but it does analyze the social conflicts that were going on in the Greek city-states. It does have a sophisticated understanding of international relations between these Greek city-states. It was a rational history. It didn't explain things like the Hebrews by saying, oh, well, Jehovah is responsible for all these events. No, there were rational, real causes, political, psychological, which explained what was happening. It became a model for writing history until the 19th century. So that's one achievement in terms of a development of a historical outlook. But going beyond that, Plato and Aristotle, who lived mainly in the first part of in the 4th century, they took this a step further because they undertook a systematic analysis of politics. They undertook to understand politics as a rational subject. So we have, for example, Plato's Republic or Aristotle's Politics are written in, and these are still studied as extremely important philosophical analyses of political life. Taking this a step further, the development of Greek philosophy. So there's writing history, there's the analysis of politics, but there is philosophy itself. Now, philosophy had begun in Greece already back in the 6th century with a kind of metaphysical kind of philosophy. There were certain philosophers whose names I'm not going to mention, but these are known as the pre-Socratic, prior to Socrates philosophers, pre-Socratic philosophers. And they asked metaphysical questions. What is the nature of reality? What is the basic element which underlies all reality? So some people said it's water. Another guy said it was air. Another guy said it was fire. But the point is that another person said it was atoms. The point is that they were trying to get back at what is the underlying cause of everything else. So the beginnings of a kind of metaphysical philosophy. Then along comes Socrates, his pupil Plato, and Aristotle. And these three individuals, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, philosophized about ethics, about politics, but also, and particularly Aristotle, begins to develop a real natural science. He begins to empirically study the natural world. And of course, again, these philosophers, from this point onwards, an education meant studying these philosophers right down into modern times. Furthermore, we can note that in mathematics, there was a definite development of mathematics. The most important individual was Pythagoras. You know the Pythagorean theorem that only touches the surface of a very sophisticated geometry. The Greek mathematics remained mainly at the level of geometry, but it was systematic and very, it was clearly a serious subject. Then, of course, we have the tremendous achievements of the Greeks in the arts, in sculpture and in architecture. In sculpture, the Greeks set the standard right down to the 16th, 17th century in what does a kind of terms of portraying the human form. This is what they were so good at. The often nude, but the human form in a style we call heroic realism. It was a realistic style, but it portrayed individuals in a heroic or absolutely beautiful, heroic portrayal of the human figure, both male and female. And then, of course, in architecture, of course, they learned from the Egyptians, but the Greeks, their temples and other buildings, using especially the pillar, they developed what we call classical architecture. And even today, some people will, this is a real throwback, we can call it postmodernism. We see actually classical buildings being built even today. It's bizarre, but people continue to build these buildings. So this becomes the standard. And to go on a little bit more and to conclude, the Greeks invent theater. Drama is a Greek invention. People went to the theater. Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, these playwrights, their plays are as good or better than anything that you could see in terms of a modern drama. So superb achievements. Then in medicine, we have the most important figure is the empirical physician Hippocrates, but Hippocrates is just one of dozens of serious empirically minded physicians. And so I've just skimmed the surface of the Greek achievement, but you can see this is a real breakthrough. And as I said, the cultural capital created by the Greeks became the standard for education right through the Roman period, and then revived during the Renaissance. This is fundamental in terms of Western civilization. Now, the last thing I want to, before we move on, I want to talk about Socrates. He died in 399, right at the beginning of the 4th century. Notice that's 5 years after the defeat of Athens. And so the death of Socrates, which is, of course, what you're dealing with in terms of your essay. So just to mention it, the war and the defeat of Athens is certainly a big factor in sort of explaining why Socrates was put to death. Of course, also the development of this rational philosophy that I'm talking about, that he in particular fostered in Athens, aroused the suspicions of the citizens. They based their beliefs on the oracles and on the temple religion. And this Socrates is philosophizing, and perhaps he's bringing into question the gods. And we know that especially the temple gods were very important in terms of political allegiance, whether or not you're a good citizen. And so this also, his philosophizing plays a role. And I would say also that it seems clear that Athens in the wake of the defeat, of course, it was a democracy, but there was an element within Athens who felt that really the failure of Athens was due to the democracy. The masses didn't know what they were doing. And amongst those people, I would say that certainly Plato was one of these characters, but it seems clear that Socrates' friends were this group that were skeptical towards democracy. And so that too plays its role. So are there any questions about, because we're concluding classical Greece and we're moving on. Okay. We're now at a new in a new beginnings of a new era. I've been speaking about classical Greece, and it begins around the 7th century and continues to the end of the 5th century. But the 4th century is really the transition to a new age inspired by classical Greece, but it no longer has the same character. And we call this period the Hellenistic age. Hellenistic means Greek-like. It's like classical Greece, but it's not the same thing. So we call it Greek-like or Hellenistic. It's the Hellenistic age. And we can specifically date it between 323 and 180. 323 basically marks the conquest of Greece and the whole by Alexander the Great, who brings the independence of the Greek city-states to an end. And it ends with the sort of the rise of the Roman Empire, which we can date about 180 BC. So it's this period of about 150 years that is the Hellenistic age. Now, we saw that, of course, the 5th century was, there was chronic warfare during this period, and it continued into the 4th century. And we saw that the wars, the Peloponnesian wars were ruinous, and things only got worse in the 4th century. Endemic warfare. Now, as this continued, and the Greek city-states, in fact, were growing weaker and weaker as a result of these wars, to the north, there was a state, a kingdom. This kingdom would now be part of, I guess, Macedonia and Bulgaria. It was, compared to the Greek city-states, it was enormously large. But it had emerged in the shadow of the Greek city-states, who, of course, were flourishing, were full of cities and so on. No, Macedon was agricultural country. It was basically all based on agriculture, and where it is located in the Balkans is good farming country. And so they produced a lot of food, which was exported to the Greeks, and there was a large peasant population. Now, in the 4th century, the king was Philip II. He was a warrior king. Under him, there was a warrior aristocracy. And then there were these peasants who could be turned into soldiers. And this is precisely what Philip II did. He created an enormous and extremely powerful army during the the central period of the 4th century. The principles of warfare were based on what the Greeks had developed, their infantry, but Philip's infantry was, units were far larger, extremely well equipped, extremely well trained, including training in siege warfare and so on. And at the same time, the aristocrats were cavalrymen, so they had a cavalry and they had an infantry. And while this military development was going on, at the same time, the Macedonians were learning Philip II, his court. He invited all kinds of Greek scholars to Macedon in order to develop, to take over whatever they could of Greek culture. They were, in Greek terms, becoming civilized. Well, the Greeks paid attention to this, but they thought of the Macedonians as hicks, as peasants, as barbarians. They didn't take it too seriously. They were surprised because in 359 BC, Philip invades the northern Greek mainland, comes down from the northern Balkans down into northern Greece, and he takes over most of the city-states in northern Greece. And the Greeks are terrified by this sudden appearance of this great new invader. The Athenians tried to rally the Greeks against Philip. And one of them, who was an orator and something of a philosopher by the name of Demosthenes, he gave a series of speeches denouncing the Macedonians. And these speeches were collected, and they are called Philippics. And these are attacks on Philip II, but they're such brilliant speeches that they became a model for a certain kind of oratory. An oratory was very important in Greek culture, the so-called Philippics of Demosthenes. Well, good speeches are one thing, but the Macedonian infantry was overwhelming. And as a result, by 346, basically Athens and the surviving Greek city-states basically had to capitulate to Philip of Macedon. And what they did was they signed a treaty which created a league. This is 337, a league against Persia. Philip agreed. The Athenians and the city-states in southern Greece and on the islands could keep their independence, but they must enter this league against the Persians. And so that's 337. So there's a kind of partial surrender of Greek sovereignty to Philip of Macedon. Well, this in itself was an achievement, but then the next year, Philip dies, and we see his son coming to the throne, Alexander of Macedon. And not only does he destroy the rest of the independence of the Greeks, he goes on to destroy Persia and to create a Greek empire, which we'll discuss on Friday.